On the night of October 30th, 1501, in the Apostolic Palace of the Vatican, the residence of the man who claimed to be the vicar of Christ on earth, the successor of St. Peter, the spiritual head of all Christendom, approximately 50 women arrived for a dinner party. They were, according to the diary of Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, courtesans. After dinner, Burchard recorded, the candelabras were placed on the floor. The chestnuts were scattered. And then the evening's competitive entertainment began. The host was Cesare Borgia. His father, watching from the room, was Pope Alexander VI. This is either the most comprehensively documented instance of institutional hypocrisy in the history of organized religion, or it is Slander, a political hit job dressed as a diary entry, written by a man with complex loyalties about powerful people who could not easily contradict him once they were dead. The honest answer is, probably somewhere between the two, in a place that is still more scandalous than almost anything else in the Vatican's long and complicated history. This is the story of Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, and what he did with the most powerful religious office in the Western world for 11 years. It is a story about a man who broke every rule while making the rules, who accumulated power through means the institution nominally condemned, and who looked at the papacy and saw not a spiritual responsibility but a family business opportunity. It is also a story about what happens when institutions refuse to govern themselves. Rodrigo Borgia was born in 1431 in Valencia, in the Kingdom of Aragon. The significant biographical fact of his early life was his uncle, Alfonso de Borgia, who became Pope Calixtus III in 1455 and immediately began practicing the Renaissance papal tradition of nepotism with the thoroughness of someone who had spent years watching others do it badly and was confident he could do it better. Rodrigo was elevated to cardinal deacon at age 25. He became vice-chancellor of the Holy See, effectively the Church's chief administrative officer, and held that position for 35 years under 5 successive popes. 35 years. 5 popes came and went. Rodrigo Borgia remained, accumulating benefices, church offices that came with income attached at a rate that made him one of the wealthiest men in Italy before he was 50. He administered, he negotiated, he built alliances, and he did all of this while maintaining an arrangement with Vanazza dei Catene that produced, over the years, at least 4 children who were entirely acknowledged as his. Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, Geoffrey. He did not hide them. He did not pretend they were someone else's. He acknowledged paternity, provided for them, and eventually gave them the kind of positions and resources that made them central players in Italian politics. The celibacy requirement of the Catholic priesthood was, for Rodrigo Borgia, a formal constraint that he treated with the respect you might give a speed limit on a road you own. None of this prevented his election as pope in 1492. The Conclave of 1492 is, in the annals of papal elections, one of the most straightforwardly corrupt on record, which is a significant achievement in a field with extremely strong competition. Rodrigo Borgia secured his election through the distribution of promises, offices, lands, money, the currency of Renaissance political alliance, to a sufficient number of cardinals to produce a majority. The Cardinal of Sforza reportedly received 4 mule-loads of silver for his vote. Other cardinals received bishoprics, abbacies, properties. Simony, the buying of church offices, was a mortal sin. Rodrigo Borgia committed it to purchase the highest church office. He took the name Alexander VI. The choice of name was either a reference to Alexander the Great, the Conqueror, the empire builder, the man who remade the world in his image, or a calculated statement that the new pope intended to be the kind of Alexander who acted first and sought forgiveness never. To understand Alexander VI's papacy, you need to understand what the papacy actually was in 1492. The Pope was not primarily a spiritual leader. He was the head of state of a significant Italian territorial power, the Papal States, which stretched across central Italy from Rome northward, and the political actor whose endorsements, alliances, and enmities shaped the balance of power on a peninsula divided among competing city-states and foreign crowns. The Pope commanded armies. The Pope negotiated treaties. The Pope's relationships with the major European monarchies, Spain, France, the Holy Roman Empire, were dynastic and financial as much as theological. Religion was the branding, politics was the product. In this context, Alexander VI's instinct to run the papacy as a Borgia family enterprise was not a departure from the institution's norms. It was the institution's norms, applied with unusual directness. Previous popes had practiced nepotism. Alexander practiced it at scale. Previous popes had been involved in Italian political violence. Alexander's son Cesare became one of the most feared military commanders in Italy. Previous popes had complicated personal lives. Alexander simply stopped maintaining the fiction. Cesare Borgia, the eldest son, was made a cardinal at 17, and then, when Alexander decided his military abilities were more useful than his ecclesiastical ones, allowed to resign the cardinalate, a procedure essentially unprecedented, and became Duke of Valentinois, captain of the papal armies, and the instrument through which Alexander attempted to carve a Borgia principality out of central Italy. Cesare was brilliant, brutal, and utterly unrestrained. He conquered cities. He had rivals murdered. He threw his brother Juan's body into the Tiber in the most widely believed theory of Juan's 1497 disappearance. He was also, by all accounts, physically magnificent, which matters only insofar as it explains why Niccolò Machiavelli, watching Cesare operate during his diplomatic missions to Borgia's court, decided this particular man was the closest thing to a rational prince he had ever seen, and used him as the model for the work that would define Western political philosophy for centuries. The ideal ruler in Machiavelli's analysis was a Borgia. Lucrezia gets a separate treatment because her reputation requires it. The Lucrezia Borgia of legend, the poisoner, the seductress, the woman who kept a hollow ring for dispatching inconvenient dinner guests, is almost entirely a construction of political propaganda. Her enemies, who were numerous and motivated, needed a monster, and she was available. Her actual documented life was considerably more complicated and, in some respects, considerably more tragic. A woman used by her father and brother as a diplomatic asset, married 3 times to serve Borgia political interests, widowed once under circumstances that involved her first husband being stabbed in the papal apartments, while her father and brother denied involvement. She eventually settled in Ferrara as Duchess, became a genuine patron of Renaissance arts and letters, and died in 1519 at 39, remembered by those who actually knew her as devout, intelligent, and kind. History preferred the poison ring. Now, the Banquet of Chestnuts. Johann Burchard was the silentiary, the master of ceremonies of the papal court. His job was to know everything that happened in the Vatican and ensure that official events proceeded with appropriate protocol. He kept a diary, the Liber Notarum, and recorded in it, with an assiduity that occasionally defies explanation, things that a prudent man in his position might have considered unwritable. The entry for October 30th, 1501, is the most cited, the most contested, and the most useful document for understanding what people believed was happening in Alexander VI's Vatican. Burchard's account describes an event held in Cesare Borgia's Vatican apartments. 50 courtesans were present. After dinner, chestnuts were placed on the floor, and the women were required to retrieve them, crawling on hands and knees in conditions of progressive undress. A competitive element followed Burchard Records' prizes of silk cloaks, shoes, and other goods offered to those who performed with the most participants. Pope Alexander VI was present. Lucrezia Borgia was reportedly present. Burchard recorded the evening as if documenting a particularly unusual administrative event, with the same tone he used for papal processions and consistories. The reliability of this account is genuinely contested, and the contest is not simply the discomfort of people who don't want it to be true. Burchard had complicated relationships with the Borgias. He was not their ally, and had reason to document their excesses. His diary circulated in manuscript form and was subject to interpolation before publication. The specific entry about the Banquet of Chestnuts contains elements that historians of the period regard as plausible, elements that seem embellished, and elements that fit suspiciously well with contemporary satirical attacks on Alexander VI that may have influenced later readers of the manuscript. What is not contested is that contemporary Italy believed the Borgias were capable of it. The satirical literature of the period, the Pasquinades, the anonymous circulated poems treated Alexander VI's sexual conduct and his use of the Vatican as a private court with a consistency that suggests the underlying premise was accepted as credible even by people who had no direct access to Burchard's diary. The most damning interpretation is not that the Banquet of Chestnuts happened exactly as Burchard described. The most damning interpretation is that it is entirely plausible that it happened, and that the reason it is plausible is that everything else about Alexander VI's papacy supports a picture of a man who had decided that the institutional constraints on papal behavior simply did not apply to him. Consider the broader record. Alexander VI openly maintained his relationship with a second mistress during his papacy, Giulia Farnese, some 40 years his junior, whose brother Alessandro Farnese received a cardinalate that Roman satirists immediately labeled the petticoat cardinal. He intervened directly and repeatedly in the political marriages and divorces of his children to serve Borgia dynastic interests, including the annulment of Lucrezia's first marriage and the murder of her second husband Alfonso of Aragon, stabbed in the papal apartments by Cesare's men in 1500. He used papal bulls, the formal authoritative decrees of the Church, to divide the newly discovered Americas between Spain and Portugal in 1493, a decision driven entirely by geopolitical interest and not remotely by any spiritual consideration. He excommunicated Girolamo Savonarola, the Florentine reforming friar, who had been preaching that Alexander VI was a corrupt monster, and then had him burned. Savonarola had been saying things about the papacy that were not inaccurate. The mechanisms of accountability that should have constrained Alexander VI were either captured or absent. The College of Cardinals was populated with his allies, his relatives, and men who had received their positions through the same processes of patronage and purchase that had put him in the papal chair. The major European monarchies, Spain, France, the Holy Roman Empire, had their own interests in maintaining relations with the papacy, and were not in the business of calling for reform on humanitarian grounds. The reform movements within the Church, the voices calling for institutional correction, were marginal, disorganized, and easily targeted as heretics or troublemakers. The institution had no effective internal mechanism for removing a pope who had gone comprehensively off the rails, and Alexander VI knew it. He died in August 1503. The cause was most likely malaria, which was endemic in Rome and killed without regard for office or sin. His contemporaries were less satisfied with this explanation. The speed and character of his body's deterioration struck observers as extraordinary bloating, blackening, a smell that drove attendants from the room within hours. Poison was the preferred explanation for those who believed God had not yet delivered a sufficiently dramatic verdict. Divine punishment was favored by the theologically inclined. A contemporary account described the corpses swelling as evidence that the devil had come to collect a debt. Modern medicine says malaria compounded by the heat of a Roman August, and a body in its early 70s that had been sustained by extraordinary energy and possibly extraordinary stress. The drama of the description probably reflects the emotional need of witnesses for the death to mean something commensurate with the life. Cesare, who was ill himself at the time, never recovered his political position after his father's death. Without the papal authority backing him, his conquered territories evaporated. The coalition that Alexander had built through a decade of marriages, murders, and political manipulation collapsed within years. Cesare died in 1507 at 31, in a skirmish in Navarre, alone and in exile from the Italian power base his father had built and lost. The man Machiavelli had called the model prince was dead at 31, having lost everything. Here is the macro-level consequence, and it is the one that actually matters for anyone trying to understand why the Borgia papacy is more than a collection of lurid anecdotes. In 1517, 14 years after Alexander VI's death, a German Augustinian friar named Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. The theses addressed, among other things, the selling of indulgences, the church's practice of accepting payment in exchange for the reduction of time in purgatory. Indulgences were not invented by Alexander VI, but the papacy he embodied, a papacy that had spent decades treating its spiritual authority as a financial instrument, and its institutional rules as optional, had made the practice so normalized, so openly commercial, so divorced from any pretense of spiritual meaning, that the moment Luther found the right language for the objection spread across Europe with the speed of something that had been building for a very long time. The Protestant Reformation was not caused by Alexander VI, but the Borgia papacy, this specific, documented, extensively satirized period of institutional corruption conducted at the absolute peak of the institution's power, was the sharpest available illustration of what critics of Rome had been arguing for generations: that the Church of Rome had become something other than what it claimed to be, that the gap between its stated purpose and its actual conduct had become too wide to ignore, and that no internal mechanism existed to close that gap. Luther's contemporaries did not need to be told that the papacy was corrupt. They had been watching the Borgias for 2 decades, and then watching the popes who came after pretend it hadn't happened. The Fifth Lateran Council, convened in 1512 to address church reform, produced elaborate documents and changed essentially nothing. It closed in 1517. Luther nailed his theses to the door the same year. Nobody had learned anything. The Banquet of Chestnuts may or may not have happened exactly as Burchard described. Alexander VI's children, his mistresses, his bought conclave, his murdered rivals, his divided hemisphere, his excommunicated reformers, these are documented. The Vatican apartments he decorated with frescoes that still survive, painted by Pinturicchio, depicting Rodrigo Borgia himself kneeling in prayer, a man who bought his way to the papacy, acknowledged his illegitimate children, and ran the church as a dynastic enterprise, painted kneeling in devotion on the walls of his own palace, which is still there, which you can visit, which the church has not demolished. The frescoes are considered historically significant works of Renaissance art. Alexander VI is not listed among the officially condemned popes. He is listed among the popes. Entry 214, Papacy, August 1492 to August 1503. predecessor Innocent VIII, successor Pius III. The chestnuts were swept up, the candles were put away, the church continued. 17 years later it broke.